Okay, good afternoon and welcome to BSides Las Vegas. Really? You can do better than that. Come on, 1, 2, 3, welcome. Yeah! Woo! Right, it's on video. We want everybody to know. Come on. Okay, we'd like to cordially invite and thank our sponsors, especially the Inner Circle sponsors, Critical Stack and Valley Mail, which are outside in case you missed them. Also like to thank Secure Code Warrior, Paranoids, and Amazon. I'm trying to say that. Okay. Cell phones, please be courteous. You know the real. Okay. I have a microphone. I will pass it around. We'll answer questions. So we'll hopefully record the conversations on there. If there's feedback needed, see the websites. Okay. And for further ado, I'd like to announce Elizabeth Wilson, our guest speaker. Thank you.
Hi, so I'm Elizabeth Wilson, and thank you for joining me today for Satellite Vulnerabilities 101. Now, just to begin, a little bit about who I am. I have a bachelor's in international business concentrated in Russian language and culture from the University of Texas at Arlington. And after I got that, I did a 180 and decided to go be a software developer for a few years. I kind of leaned on some Java I learned back in high school and passed an entry test and they let me in. So did that for about 1.5 years to 2 until I got a scholarship for my master's degree. And I'm currently wrapping up my international master in security, intelligence, and strategic studies, concentrating in security and technology, based at the University of Glasgow, Dublin City University, and Charles University in Prague. Now, the whole reason this talk even came to be is while I was in Prague, I got the opportunity to take a course in space security, and I ended up writing my final paper on satellites and their vulnerabilities overall, which has turned into this talk. Now, I also just wrapped up a visiting research position over the summer at ETH Zurich's Center for Security Studies, which ended about a week ago. So a week ago today, I was 9 hours forward. So excuse me if I'm also a little bit jet lagged still. Now, to begin, as one of humanity's global commons, the frontier of space is really the responsibility of the entire international community. It's one of the most important space assets, if not the most important, for both civilians and militaries here on Earth. Now, they're used by billions of people every day without oftentimes really thinking about it. They've kind of become utilities that we just sort of take for granted until we reach a point where they're unavailable. Now, we use them for, of course, Earth observation, communications, navigation, even precise timing and location for precise timing technologies such as banking and deep space telescopes. Now, the most notable consequences that we would have if we lost a swath of our satellites would be, for one, communications and transactions breakdown, potentially, of course, to the point of complete unavailability due to the increased loads on the terrestrial infrastructure, as well as the lack of GPS forcing people to actually plot their routes manually again, which would be interesting. Most would probably still just do it on their phones, but some might break out paper maps. And also, the systems that have very precise timing, such as in banking, would suffer from clock drift, which might end in freezing accounts because they have to have the transactions very tightly tied to the timing, actually. Now, there's also going to be, of course, loss of military capabilities and negative impacts on weather prediction and climate data collection as well. Now, it's just a little overview here. These are the basic vulnerable nodes for satellite transmissions. And for example, say you were making a satellite phone call. You would be the requesting entity. You would send out the request through to your service provider, who would then send it up in an uplink to a satellite, which would then bounce it, of course, through at least one other satellite and back down a downlink to more terrestrial infrastructure to the ending caller. And it would, of course, then go back the other direction to make the connection for the phone call. But each of these nodes is somewhere where the satellite systems are vulnerable. Now, there are two main categories of vulnerabilities, and this would be physical and cyber. But there is also hybrid vulnerabilities where, say, somebody hacks into a satellite and then moves it into a dangerous situation physically, or say somebody uses physical force to corrupt the data on the satellite. So those are also potentialities where it's a little bit of both. Today I'm going to start with physical vulnerabilities. Now, satellites are inherently easier to damage than any earthbound object due to their orbital velocity and the exposure to radiation that they have that we are shielded from our atmosphere. Now, these can be either accidental or intentional issues. Primarily, our main threats right now are actually accidental, especially with the case of collision risk that's been increasing. But there's also terrestrial and extraterrestrial weather interruptions as well. Now, as I mentioned, accidental collision risk is definitely growing very heavily, especially with the propagation of things like the small sat constellations that are going up currently. A lot of them don't even have propulsion systems, which means if there's an oncoming collision, they cannot move out of the way. One study even found that it was a 30 times increased risk between 100.01 meter satellites versus a single 1 meter satellite due to the disbursement of the satellites increasing the likelihood of impact. And this is particularly worrisome when all it takes is about a centimeter of an object to do mission critical damage to a satellite. Now, as far as terrestrial weather interruptions go, there is rain fade and ionospheric scintillation, which can both interrupt and degrade signals for different reasons. In the case of rain fade, it's either electromagnetic interference or the absorption of the broadcast, while scintillation actually kind of acts like a refraction of the signal and slowly degrades it until it's no longer recognizable. Now, extraterrestrially, we have radiation as a very big threat, which we typically shield by thickening the spacecraft walls. It's really the only time that any sort of space armor is actually useful here. But not all radiation can actually be shielded against. In the case of the Van Allen radiation belts, which you can actually see in the background of this slide is a depiction of them. These are two belts of catastrophic radiation that have been trapped in our gravity well. And this is actually an area where one of those hybrid attacks would be a potential of potentially happening here. Because if you hacked into a satellite and moved it into one of these belts, you could easily destroy it. Now, solar flares are also the other option for potential radiation damage to satellites. They can degrade signals or destroy the lifetime of a satellite. Now, unfortunately, this physical aspect really is the most difficult area to mitigate risk in. Anything can really be turned into a weapon against a satellite, which is kind of why it's a bit silly when people talk about banning space weapons. Because, I mean, a satellite itself can be used as a weapon. All it takes is a single centimeter object to do damage enough to destroy the satellite, more or less, and 10 centimeters, I believe it is, for catastrophic disintegration. And with all of the debris that we actually have nowadays going up, increasing and increasing, especially with the ASAT tests, it's becoming harder to track this debris as well. And so people have been testing their anti-satellite weapons, such as the direct ascent and co-orbital style ones. And the difference in these two is really just the style of how it attacks. A direct ascent anti-satellite weapon would come up directly from the Earth and intersect immediately with the satellite, while a co-orbital anti-satellite weapon actually goes into space and sits and waits, kind of like a ticking time bomb. And eventually, when it comes into the path, it goes off. Now, there's a handful of countries that have proven their anti-satellite weapon technologies over the years. Most recently, this year was India. And I believe that was back in March. And how I mentioned the issue with the debris growing, you can see here this is a plot from, I believe it was the end of June, that shows the debris that's still in the air right now from the Indian satellite test. And also to the left is an animation from the ESA showing the orbital debris and how much we have accumulated space junk over time. I mean, this is just the easiest to depict. Of course, there's much more small, tiny things you can't see as well. And those are the most threatening, to be honest, because they're the hardest to track. The other form of anti-satellite weapon is directed energy weapons, and these would be lasers or microwaves. In the case of lasers, you can either dazzle or blind sensors typically, but if it's a strong enough laser, of course, you can also do physical damage too. while microwaves are more for interrupting processors and maybe even permanently damaging the electronics on board. An interesting aspect of these kinds of attacks is that the attacker may not even really know whether they were successful or not. It might not actually outwardly show that there was damage done to the satellite, even if they are successful. This is also an area for another potential hybrid attack, like with the microwaves, where they could potentially destroy the data on board with a physical attack. Now, moving on to cybersecurity challenges. And if anyone's curious, the binary does say something. It's part of the intro to Star Wars Episode 4. I had to fill it with something. Now, of course, there's the typical insecure practices and issues that affect normal networks are going to impact satellites as well, because they are tied into these networks. Backdoors, hard-coded passwords, insecure authentication, all of those kinds of things. But to top that off, satellites have extremely long life cycles, and that exacerbates the issues here, where you get these immensely old legacy systems that have had immense investment going into them, and then you have issues with patching it. It's potentially even impossible to patch it because of a lack of knowledge, time, or money, or the inavailability of even having downtime because it's a critical system. So you can end up with very critical hardware or software issues that just can't be fixed. Now, there was an analog to digital transition that happened over the years that they really didn't have cybersecurity in mind in this process. And the fact that satellites have very limited processing power, things like encryption eat up a lot of processing power, and you just can't put it on there because it takes up too much space. And that sort of also compacts with the fact that some people have made their satellites as a labor of love and say it's just for scientific reasons, and they never even really considered the fact that somebody might want to hack it in the future and redirect the processing power to something malicious. Some people just never thought about it. And this is exemplified by the fact that when the Iridium network was launched, it was considered essentially too complex to hack. This is from 2007. It's a leaked PowerPoint slide from Iridium, and it says, "The complexity of the Iridium air interface makes the challenge of developing an Iridium L-band monitoring device very difficult and probably beyond the reach of all but the most determined adversaries." This is extremely nearsighted. They really didn't bother with security at all. It's kind of the old security by obscurity idea, which is not very smart. Less than a decade later, the Chaos Computer Club in Germany came together for their Chaos Computer Camp, and they took this hubris as a challenge, and they decided to throw together some homemade systems for snooping on the Iridium pager satellite system, and they managed a basic one for about €50, and it was less than $1,000 to get a pretty solid setup here. They were not able to intercept every signal, nor were they able to decrypt every one that they intercepted, but it was a significant percentage. And if anyone's more curious about this, you can check out Iridium Hacking, Please Don't Sue Us on CCC's website. It's a really interesting talk, and I highly recommend it. Now, continuing on with other vulnerabilities, satellite jamming is a major vulnerability in these systems, partially because the satellite GPS signals are actually weak by design. So it's very easy to overpower them. And jammers you can actually buy pretty availably online. It's illegal to buy in most countries and illegal to use, but in the UK it's only illegal to use, interestingly enough. So this can also be intentional or accidental because of how easy it is to happen, actually. In 2007, the US Navy was in San Diego conducting an exercise, and they accidentally took down a large part of the city's infrastructure because it impacted ATMs, cell phones, airport traffic, and a bunch of other critical systems when they decided to do some jamming out in the bay. And of course, they stepped forward and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, this was us." But for a while, there was a lot of confusion going on in the city because all of a sudden, people's cell phones weren't working. You couldn't use the ATM. Was it a major attack? No, thankfully. But it could have been, and that's one of the issues there. A less threatening one was for 10 minutes a day in the London Stock Exchange. They also had it go down every day for 10 minutes for a long time. And it was thought that somebody was hiding from their boss, essentially like a delivery driver of some kind, and it was intercepting the stock exchange's connections up for the timing with the atomic clocks and the GPS systems. So that's just more of a nuisance, though, in that case. Now, GPS spoofing goes one step further from jamming, and rather than just blocking it, it also replaces the signal with a fake one. In 2017, there was an issue with a bunch of ships in the Black Sea where they would show up with lost GPS fixing position, or it would say that they were in the Gelinjik airport over 25 nautical miles away. Now, they were pretty sure they were not in the airport, so obviously there was a little bit of something going on there. And a very similar issue actually started happening around the Kremlin as well with taxis, and it would show that they were actually at one of the Moscow airports rather than where they were near Red Square in the Kremlin. So these kinds of attacks are actually a big threat, because if it was enacted at a critical time during a military mission, it could severely impact our people. And as a last example for this section, one of the first cases of satellite interference, Captain Midnight. This was John McDougal, who dubbed himself Captain Midnight, and decided to use his position at a satellite company one night to take over HBO's broadcast for about 5 minutes. And he displayed this lovely message of "Good evening, HBO from Captain Midnight, $12.95 a month, no way, Showtime and Movie Channel beware." And an interesting aspect here, if you go and look at a recording on YouTube from when somebody was recording this night for the film that was on, The Falcon and the Snowman, you can see that HBO tried to retake back over the signal. The show starts to come back, and then it turns back to this message again. And what was happening was HBO was increasing the strength of their uplink to try and overtake him, and he'd increase his strength, and then they increased theirs, and eventually they gave up because they didn't want to damage their satellite. And so he finally quit because he was afraid of getting caught, which of course he eventually did. And he's actually the reason the Electronic Communications Privacy Act of 1986 was passed, which made satellite hijacking a felony. So in his case, it was not a felony because it wasn't a felony yet. Yeah, first, like he said. So also, satellites have vulnerabilities that arise from their terrestrial support networks. These are the connections of the people who run them and the ground systems themselves, like NASA headquarters. This attack surface and the variety of vulnerabilities are both very great. There's a wide variety of ground infrastructure to be attacked. As of 2011, NASA had 190 IT assets, all dispersed around the US, that were linked into critical projects like rovers and satellites. Now, these high-value targets have typical security threats, from cyber issues to supply chain attacks and insider threats and accidents. So these networked high-value targets are hit very hard with hacking attempts. Eventually, something is going to get through between phishing and social engineering, malware, and APTs. It's near inevitable. The larger that an organization is personnel-wise, the more likely that something is going to make it through. The human element really is the weakest link in these technological systems. In these cases, in 2007 and 2008, hackers got into NASA's systems via the internet and actually got to the point where they could have commanded the satellites. They never sent any commands, but they could have. And that's a little worrisome. Now, as I said, the human element's really the weakest link, and this is also where insider threats come forth. The big issue with insider threats is you don't really know they're a threat until something happens, because they're trusted. And it's very hard to mitigate this kind of a risk. A real-life example here would be Gregory Justice, who worked for Boeing Satellite Systems. He was feeling a bit unappreciated at work and had a bunch of pressure for money for his wife's medical bills and an online girlfriend that his wife didn't know about. And he decided to try and meet with Russian intelligence in a hotel room to pass on some sensitive satellite information. It was subject to export controls, of course, and surprise, it was not Russian intelligence that he met with. It was the FBI. So he got caught in this case, thankfully. Now, moving on to a last example here, very small aperture terminals are an interesting case, because these are mobile satellite system receivers, essentially, and they have them on many boats and ships around the world. And this is actually what came up with this little tweet here in the corner. Somebody created a live ship tracker via Shodan. There was exposed web services where they could actively track these ships due to the VSATS systems on board. And it was just the default credentials of admin1234, of course. So quite easy to find online, or just to try a couple of times and you might get it. So some basic security hygiene really would have stepped in here and made it a little bit harder for this to happen. Definitely an interesting case. I think that the link doesn't work anymore. I think they've patched the issues that were there at this point, but I haven't checked it in a few months, so there might be more issues again. Now, to conclude here, though, satellite security is multi-stakeholder and multifaceted. These systems are widely dispersed both on Earth and above it, creating a very large attack surface for both physical and cyber attacks. There's a wide variety of vulnerabilities that are impacting this area, many of which are just due to the nature of satellites themselves and the way that they've evolved. Now, malevolent actors, nature, and accidents are really some of the biggest threats to these areas, but some basic security hygiene would really go a long way. Some really basic security hygiene, like changing passwords. Now, we really need more cooperation internationally to address these issues. Like I said at the beginning, this is a global commons that we are working in, just like the open oceans. We need to work internationally together. We've had trouble with people, say, applying to put up a satellite here in the US and getting denied, and then taking it to India, and India putting it up. Issues like this add more threat to our orbit, to adding more junk. We need to have more agreements and more conversation between our countries, the ones who have the capabilities of putting things up into orbit. Anyways, thank you for your time today. I hope you enjoyed this. And do I have any questions?
Cool. Have you looked into the case where Iran captured a U.S. drone? Was that GPS spoofing?
I have not looked into that specific case, though I have read a little bit about it. Oh yeah, there's socks.
Thanks for presenting, first of all. Have you seen any research on exploiting satellites for financial gain, as far as location of shipping, et cetera?
I've heard about it a little bit, but I haven't seen anything concrete.
Hollywood and various others love talking about the Kessler effect and how we could end up blinded for centuries until this stuff comes down. What would it take to actually achieve that? Not obviously asking for myself, but just out of interest.
I mean, it would probably have to be an issue with the debris just getting so cumbersome, so much of it that we can't track, and so much small pieces that it just slowly. I honestly don't think it would ever get to the point that the extremist point that they take in the whole Hollywood view, but it could make it where we really can't put anything more up there because it's just not safe. We need some form of debris management system.
So my statement's not a question. It's more so from a previous history of consulting with LASP in Boulder, Colorado around satellite management. When we design systems, we design them for 50 years of support, right? 50 years is a long time. The last projects that I saw there, we're still managing Cassini, and Cassini was managed on Solaris 8. And when vulnerabilities came out for Solaris 8, and being that it was now owned by Oracle and having to rely on Oracle to create patches, Oracle would take 6 months or longer to create patches for our satellite systems. So just something to keep in mind that support is hard to find sometimes on these older systems.
Oh, absolutely.
Sorry. In your research, have you come across anything that would resemble good redundancy or any redundancy systems for a lot of these exploits that these individuals here have been asking about? Things, I know there are a lot of systemic redundancies for the actual physical devices, but any sort of kind of like a networking, like if one goes down, there's like more to pick them up, things like that.
I mean, that's honestly something that they're actively working on right now, to have more of, but the part of the problem with that is the more you put up there, the more hazards you're putting up there as well. But that's part of why they're putting up so many constellations nowadays, is for that resiliency, why they're kind of switching to those
Last question.
Thanks for the talk, really interesting. Do you have any examples of K-band attacks in terms of downlink, or failing that, any other examples of specific, like times you mentioned, like protocol attacks?
I do not currently at this time.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank y'all.